Good day to each and everyone. My name is Arlene Casajo, and I'm here to talk about the disaster and mental health. Chapter 10: The Experience of the Nairobi U.S. Embassy Bombing. So, on August 7, 1998, at 10:30 a.m., a terrorist bomb exploded in downtown Nairobi. But prior to that, a hand grenade had exploded, and many people had gone to their windows to investigate what was going on. Then, the main explosion, consisting of 1 ton of TNT and measuring 2.7 on the Richter scale, went off. So, earlier that time, there was a hand grenade that exploded, and that's why many people wanted to investigate about what is happening. So there are 213 people died and 5,000 sustained injuries that took them to the hospitals around the city, and many others had minor injuries that did not require medical attention. And all these people, their friends and relatives, and many others who witnessed the event directly or indirectly through the extensive TV, radio, and newspaper coverage were affected by the event. So, as you can see, there are a lot of people who were affected on the bombing. There were 213 people that died, and plus the 5,000 people who have injuries. So, according to the estimates, Kenya lost 5 to 10% of its gross domestic product or GDP as a result of the bombing. 100 buildings and 250 businesses were wholly and partially damaged. Of the 5,000 wounded or people who sustained injuries, there are 400 people who remained severely disabled. So as you can see, that's how severe the bombing affected the people in Nairobi. And the people in Nairobi is in Kenya. So there are many Kenyans who were affected in that bombing. So for the immediate rescue responses, immediate issues arising included the challenges of the ensuing rescue process, first aid to the injured, transportation to the hospital, the very large numbers with open and bleeding wounds, and the chaos that is usual following any major disaster. So this was the first real test of the Kenya spirit, or the Harambee, or the Let's Pull Together following a terrorist attack like their counterparts would do in New York on September 11, 2001. So Kenyans discharged themselves with honor and decorum. The traditional boundaries of race, tribe, religion, class, and creed were discarded in the face of disaster that did not itself make this distinction, as it killed and maimed. All Kenyans were equal before the terrorists, and their response was equal to the task. So, if you're wondering what was the reason why the U.S. Embassy or the Nairobi U.S. Embassy were bombed, so as I tried to search for different articles, I found out that it was because of the motivation and preparation. The bombings are widely believed to have been revenge for U.S. involvement in the extradition and alleged torture of the four members of Egyptian Islamic Jihad, or the EIJ, who had been arrested in Albania. So that's just a gist of the article that I read of why does the Nairobi U.S. Embassy bombing happen. So let's go back. So for the mental health response, amidst all this, however, it was quickly realized that there would be a lot of psychological, emotional, and social issues that would need to be dealt with. So the Operation Recovery was the project that was initiated by the Kenya Medical Association to the respond to this need. So the project that was initiated again was the Operation Recovery, and also the Operation Recovery was the project that was initiated, and the project brought together medical personnel, corporate firms, professional bodies, government agencies, and individuals, with the prime goal of developing and implementing a coordinated psychosocial recovery and assistance program for those affected by the bomb blast. So, the objectives or the goal of the Operation Recovery is to give a psychosocial recovery assistance program to the people who were affected by the bomb blast. So the Red Cross also and other organizations put together other initiatives in different parts of the city. So the overall response was planned to alleviate human suffering resulting directly or indirectly from the bomb and to assist the people of Kenya to recover from the effects. So that was the main goal and the objectives of the Operation Recovery. It was also planned to offer psychological and emotional support through counseling to those injured in the blast, to relatives of those who died, to relatives of those injured, to rescue workers and to medical personnel, as well as to the general public. And that was what the objectives of Operation Recovery. So next, let's go on to the media response. So the media was to prove to be an invaluable asset in the early stages of the tragedy. So the first of the media activities was a cable news network or the CNN appearance by the author in the afternoon of August 7. So this was the first internationally televised statement from a medical doctor regarding the bomb attack. Most Kenyans were still not aware of that terrorists had visited the country, resulting to catastrophic damage. So as you can see, media response is also helpful in spreading awareness to the people in Kenya that there were um, bombing that happens to their place. And the media was to prove to be an invaluable asset in the early stages of the tragedy. So the purpose of this extensive media program thus became to educate the people on what reactions to expect of this following trauma, and to reassure them that theirs were indeed normal reactions to an abnormal event. The broadcasts also sought to help sensitize people to the possible mental health needs that could arise subsequently and to let them know that help was available and where it could be obtained. So next was the planning longer term services. So the planning of service provision proved most challenging. The knowledge base of the Kenyan mental health team was somewhat limited. So this was, however, more than compensated by the enthusiasm, the empathy, and the desire to learn. So the army of counselors with varying degrees of knowledge converged at the Medical Association head office demanding training opportunities to be able to help fellow Kenyans. So some were lay counselors who had attended an afternoon of training and counseling, while others in the minority were highly seasoned mental health experts. So as you can see, um, after the event or after the disaster, um, you can actually check or you can actually observe how chaotic was the service after the disaster. And there are a lot of neighboring countries who help Kenyans to overcome the disaster, and also who they really help the people to overcome about what is happening. So by the time the U.S. Secretary of State visited Kenya and the initial scene of the confusion were settling down, American disaster management experts were on the ground and played a crucial role in the planning of services. So as you can see, the U.S. Secretary of the state visited Kenya, and they really offered a lot. They offered a help to the people in Kenya to play a crucial role in planning of services. So next is the crisis intervention. So the greatest challenge in the first week was to provide a crisis intervention service to those in greatest need. So while sorting out the ragtag army that was to prove so vital in the coming months, one of the collaborating agencies, which was the church, based organized the one-day training that enabled the team to adapt and standard format on the briefing and reporting back to headquarters. So there were three church compounds that became the walk-in counseling centers in less than a week. So as you can see, um, there are a lot of interventions, but those interventions were not as planned, and it was some sort of chaotic since um, after what happened, they really need to have a quick response or quick response to the people who are suffering in the traumatic on that traumatic disaster. So there were debriefing, psychoeducation, and long-term counseling were some of the strategies put in place. A typical debriefing session would involve a group of 8 to 12 people and last between 1 hour and 1.5 hours. So as you can see, um, there were a lot of interventions, but those interventions was not as planned as it is. And I mean, it was just so the people behind that was just so unready about the crisis or the disaster that was happened. So, however, due to the large numbers of people being dealt with, groups as large as 25 people were held. Sessions as long as 3 hours were also held to give everyone an opportunity to speak. Two facilitators would run each group along the Mitchell model. So for many, particularly the men, hearing that the other men also cried was very reassuring in view of the African view of men crying. So they simply don't cry as it was their like tradition, and that's what they believe in, that men should not cry. So it reassured, so people there or therapists there or medical practitioners there reassured them that such reaction could indeed be found even in other real men. So they really need to to they really need to explain to the Kenyans how how a real man or how a people or how a person could have that emotions whenever there is something traumatic happened to them. And also for the women in the groups, the main issue was the fear of their families, particularly their children. And they always kept on questioning what would have happened to my children if I had died, who would have looked after them. So what that was a common question to be heard in such sessions, for that counseling sessions. So again, psychoeducation was an integral part of the briefing sessions for us to know more about the emotions and the thinking of the people in Kenyans throughout the traumatizing event that happened to them. And after each group member had the opportunity to share their experience, and the counselor facilitating the group session would then educate the group on the effects of trauma and what they would expect. This proved to be very useful as the most people experiencing the acute stress reaction signs and symptoms frequently feared that they could be going mad. So next, let's talk about the children's program. So the government of Kenya requested Operation Recovery to provide counseling services to traumatized children in around the city, and 10% of the 360 schools in Nairobi were considered to be high risk due to their proximity to the blast. So there were from the 360 schools around Nairobi, the, there were 10% of the schools that was considered a high risk due to their proximity to the blast, or they were the most affected by the bombing. So the children were severely traumatized by the bomb blast, and more than 6 months after the blast, the children still remembered with horror the Big Bang, blood, burning cars, helicopters, and many military men. So children were really affected and traumatized about the bomb blast, and even after 6 months of the disaster, the children still remember the the blast, the bloods, the bloods that they saw, the burning cars, the loud helicopters, and the military men. So as you can see, even after 6 months, the children really cannot forget about the disaster that happened to that country. So different strategies had to be employed to suit different circumstances. Story writing, discussion, and drawing were important school tools of communications, and even the counselors became increasingly creative and confident. And because of the different takes of people about the traumatizing event that was happened, there were also the counselors also um, have different strategies to to just to help the people who are in need. Like they use story writing, discussion, drawing, so that people, or I mean children, can divert their thinking, or their thinking about the trauma. And also using your young counselors for school children proved exceptionally effective in the program, and the children identified with them easily as they spoke their slang language or shang. So it is much helpful that counselors help children to also divert their thinking about, or their thoughts about, the traumatizing event that was happened to them, especially that these young counselors can speak their slang language, or what we call the Sheng language of them. So next is the outreach service. So for the outreach service were provided for the affected communities. They were aimed at not only providing counseling services to the people where they lived and worked, but also increasing awareness of the possible psychological effects of a trauma of this magnitude, and reinforcing the message that help was available. So the use of road shows where they presented the message of the effect of trauma. They present the message of the effect of trauma on normal humans, and it was also similarly conveyed through music and dramatization. So one way of also having their outreach service is using road shows, as they present um, the effects of trauma to normal humans, and also they conveyed it through the music and dramatizations. So there are a lot of innovative ways of reaching people um, that were used. Again, the road shows, and that were made impossible by the contribution of one of the partners in the project. The large trucks normally used to advertise consumer products attract crowds of 5,000 to 10,000 people in urban and peri-urban centers through the medium of loud secular music, or again through music and dramatization. So now let's talk about the responding to special groups. So children, rescue workers, and medical workers, as well as the newly handicapped, comprised the special needs in group. Firefighters did not receive as much as attention from the teams as we would have wished. We recognized them as a special high risk group for the development of psychological of the trauma they experienced in the course of rescue work. So firefighters also do have a lot of trauma, but they have the high risk, or special high risk, of having a trauma afterward after the disaster happened, but they did not receive as much as attention from the teams as again we would have wished. So we were, however, spread out thin on the ground, and this in inadvertently became one group that received less attention than would have been adequate for them. So debriefing was the only intervention for firefighters to be given to a small number of again firefighters, and long-term effects of this omission can be expected. So medical workers also who had to deal with all the injured people as well as listen to the very horrific stories that many had to tell were exposed to this type of traumatization. So it was largely in the training session that contact was finally made with services, and it was common in the debriefing sessions that were held for some to break down and cry in what was usually their first expression of they truly felt. So they were also um, they were also been debriefed by the medical health practitioners, and they were or the counselors. They were also being counseled to check their mental health in terms of the trauma that they had in the disaster. So next is the external health. So one consequences of disaster of this of a disaster of this magnitude is a sense of hopeless isolation and a need to engage informed personnel colleagues in the response effort. So specific requests were made to the American Psychiatric Associations and the Royal College of Psychiatrists in the United Kingdom. So as a result of this, a U.S. federal government disaster management expert, Brian Flynn, who had experience in the Project Heartland that responded to the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995, came to Nairobi. So one of the person who has an experience in in a also bombing response is Mr. Brian Flynn. He was also an expert in handling people or in handling disaster management. So from the Royal College of Psychiatrists, we got David Alexander, who had led the mental health team following the Piper Alpha disaster. So there are a lot of people or experts who came to Nairobi to help on how to handle the disaster management. So specific requests again made to the American Psychiatric Associations, the Royal College of Psychiatrists in the UK, the US National Medical Association provided the rest of the overseas body of experts highly valued by the Kenyans in the hour of need. So next is the importance of effective leadership. So actually, Kenya, like the rest of African's continent, was at the time a deeply traumatized country by both natural and man-made disasters. Floods and politically motivated violence had led to many deaths and much destruction of property. So this was the first time that Kenyans responded to any disaster with a mental health component. It was critical to have a clear and decisive leadership, which was provided by the Kenya Medical Association. So there is a really much importance on effective leadership, especially when I mean, your country suffers from a disaster, and being the leader of the country, it's really your responsibility on how to handle things, especially to your people, and to you don't want to see your people suffering from those disasters, right? So effective leadership is very much important, especially nowadays. So, next is for pregnant women. So, pregnant women, during counseling sessions, some women reported spontaneous abortions, usually in the first trimester, while some reported spontaneously going into labor early on the day of the bomb blast or soon thereafter. Others reported the unanticipated occurrence of their menses, while one complained that her breast milk had suddenly dried up. So, as you can see, the bombing or the blast also affected uh, not just affected all the people, but also especially the pregnant women. It affected physically, especially that again there were there once a pregnant woman who complained that her breast milk had suddenly dried up is because of the trauma that she suffered after the disaster, and also there were some or spontaneous cases that was reported about the abortions, spontaneous abortions, and the spontaneously going into labor early after the pregnant women suffered about the traumatic experience. And also a group of women who were pregnant at that time were brought together soon after the first anniversary of the bomb blast. 15 of them reportedly exaggerated startle response in their children, which was materially different from other children at the same stage of development. So this is a reflection of a material hyperarousal and part of maternal PTSD or post traumatic stress disorder. It was an interesting observation as it was a spontaneous observation by the experience of mothers. It raises interesting questions regarding maternal exposures to stress and PTSD in the offspring. So it's not just about the mom or the pregnant woman who suffered the traumatic, but also the traumatic experience was also passed to her offspring or to the baby. So next, so in managing disasters, things can can do and do go wrong. So as the Kenyans responded to the disaster in their own way, the American people who were principal target of the attack were having problems of their own. So the distance and the time differences were to prove problematic. The response was occasionally chaotic and marred by a host of planning and logistical failures, especially in the area of military transportation. So, when a disaster happens, you cannot really think that the interventions would be perfect because this was a disaster and people really don't know what is happening. So after the disaster, the interventions were really needed. So the interventions came up that it was not as planned as they expected, and it was really hard to plan things, especially there are many people who were affected in this disaster. So actually, this is the last slide of my um, this is the last slide of the chapter 10 of my topic for today. And many questions have been asked about the mental health response effort. Some have wondered what it achieved and what benefits came to the people of Kenya. There are no there are no simple or accurate answers to these questions. However, as a psychiatrist and mental health professionals, We live in a world where the challenges to our profession extend beyond clinics and hospitals. And for this reason, post-disaster mental health response is an integral part of the duty of the mental health team. Controversy continues to surround the usefulness or otherwise of early interventions and in particular debriefing. Since studies have shown diametrically opposed results, this valid academic discussion is, however, quickly thrown out in the face of real life disaster. So the community expects and demands help from the mental health experts.